From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And featured today from the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at K-State, Brian Briggeman. He'll dig into a new analysis that his center just finished, which looked at the soaring fertilizer price situation and how it's affecting the financial state of farm cooperatives. He used data from the last time that fertilizer prices spiked and then plummeted as a benchmark for assessing the current financial vulnerability of various sized cooperatives, and he shares his findings on their ability to navigate this volatile fertilizer market. Further ahead, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham will offer guidelines on watering those landscape trees and shrubs here in this dry midwinter. That's what's ahead on this Agriculture Today. Thanks for tuning in. This is Agriculture Today. The subject of crop fertilizer is a boiling topic right now in agriculture, what with the rapid escalation and severe hike in fertilizer prices. You producers are well acquainted with this story by now. Well, recently, a couple of folks here at Kansas State University inspected this question from a very unique angle, and it is important to Kansas agriculture what they've done here, and specifically to our cooperatives in Kansas. They've looked at the impact of those higher fertilizer prices on the ability of those cooperatives to be vendors of those products and still stay in good stead economically. Joining us now from the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University, it's Director Brian Briggeman, one of those who just penned a paper on this very topic. Brian, before we talk of what you and your colleague have done in as far as this analysis, and you'll explain the nature of it, how did we get here? Why is the fertilizer market so much in the stratosphere now?
Right. It's really a topic being discussed, like you said, among producers, among agribusinesses, among cooperatives, among lenders, because fertilizer is so important to growing the very large crops that we do, right, in terms of bushel and yield and where we come from. So, what has led to this more than doubling of fertilizer prices, a lot of it ties back to supply chain issues. Some may be related to COVID, but not necessarily. We look over in Europe and we have, producers just halting production because of their extremely high natural gas prices. You look here domestically, looking at Hurricane Ida going through the Gulf Coast and disrupting where we produce a lot of our own fertilizer and, creating challenges within those logistical networks. China is also another major supplier of many types of fertilizer. And, with the soaring energy prices there, as well as other production issues that they faced, that supply into the marketplace has also come down. Continue to look abroad. Russia is another large exporter. They have reduced their supply. And then even Turkey has banned fertilizer exports entirely. So when we look at all of this global and even domestic issues from a supply standpoint, when we restrict that supply, it's going to naturally push up those prices. So that has, led to something that maybe many of your listeners are familiar with. This isn't the first time we've had this kind of fertilizer price run up.
This happened, in the late 2000s and associated with a recession?
Correct. So in 2007, 2008, the Great Financial Recession, we kind of had a little bit of a different story, right? So a lot of it leading into that would led to a lot of that big price increase was just pretty strong demand. We had very strong demand as, we had ethanol mandates that were coming in, and we were producing a lot more corn, right? And that uses a lot more fertilizer. So there was strong demand coming there. And so we had that demand pull up. And then when we hit the financial crisis, that created a big recession that had ramifications, and those prices collapsed. And when that happens, that can one could be of benefit to a producer, for example, right? So if a farmer had delayed those purchases of fertilizer to the point when they fell and were able to source that product at a much cheaper price, it was to their benefit, right? But that's not always the case, right? There are others who retail and who sell fertilizer that may get caught holding some really expensive inventories.
And that happened in '08, did it not then, that heavy losses were incurred by cooperatives and other type vendors?
Yes, so there were cooperatives, independent retailers. This was actually something I remember when I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and we were studying this and talking to a lot of different retailers, and some even to the extreme of they had sourced so much high-priced fertilizer inventory and they were open to market movements that when it fell and they had to sell that very inexpensive now fertilizer, they had bought it, you buy high, sell low, which is not a good marketing strategy. But that's what they got caught with. And in some cases, severe cases, there were some bankruptcies. But it was not extremely widespread. It was kind of isolated. But we do see that as we look across all cooperatives across the U.S., and including here in Kansas, there was an effect that did create some stress.
And that serves then as backdrop and maybe the inspiration behind the work that you and colleagues here at K-State have undertaken as you looked back to 2008 and then what might be happening present day to cooperatives as these fertilizer prices are expected to be extraordinarily high for some time. You wanted to analyze that further, you say?
Yeah, just not that we're trying to put together a crystal ball and figure out what's going to happen with fertilizer prices in the future. Believe me, Eric, if I could do that, you and I probably wouldn't be talking, or else you would be paying me quite a bit of money because right. I would be able to see into the future. But rather take it from the standpoint of what did we learn in 07, 08? Let's apply it to today. And let's see what's going on in the cooperative industry because, as you said, especially here in Kansas, farmer co-ops are so important to the state, not only from a place in which to deliver your grain, but also to purchasing supplies such as fertilizer. So we wanted to take a look back to start and to see what's going on.
What was learned from the experiences in 2008 then, in as far as the direct implications for cooperatives that merchandise fertilizer?
Yeah, so probably one of the big things in starting from, what happened, fertilizer inventory write-downs did occur. I mean, some co-ops were left open in the marketplace. And if we look at this data, my PhD student, Gerald Mishangi, and I worked together to analyze for this fact sheet. And we said, okay, well, let's just look back during that period of time and how did those fertilizer inventory write-downs, what can we observe in the data? And one thing that came out, and we looked at different sizes of farmer co-ops, and again, this is across the United States, to say, okay, who was the most impacted during that time? And when we look at it, it's the smaller co-ops, mid-sized co-ops. So smaller co-ops being less than $50 million in sales, mid-sized co-ops being between $50 and $150 million in sales. What happened to their retained earnings? Right. So retained earnings, a balance sheet item, it's equity, it's profits that are reinvested back into the cooperative that are held there, not tied to members. But kind of think of it maybe something more people are used to hearing is owner's equity, right? So like what happened to that retained earnings? What occurred? And one thing we see in the data for those small and mid-sized co-ops, it did go down a fair amount. We did see that go down, and they had to use some of that retained earnings in order to finance those fertilizer inventory write-downs. Larger co-ops of above $150 million didn't have as much of an impact, and maybe some of that is don't know exactly why. Could be just due to scale economies that they would have, being able to absorb those losses where we had plenty of retained earnings. You didn't see it as much. Might be some different strategies that they had in place. But what we do observe in the data that it did have an impact across the farmer cooperative landscape.
Your objective then was to bring that data into the picture and then create a mechanism to see if those sorts of patterns hold or are likely to hold true here with the present situation?
Correct. So we wanted to say, okay, what happened back then? And let's put together a stress test methodology or model to say, all right, how would this flow through? How would it all occur? What would happen if we had a fertilizer price collapse? So two things are part of it. One, we have to look at how exposed you are to the market. And when I say open to the market or exposed, you have purchased fertilizer that you have not sold yet. So it's not price protected. I'm holding it, and if it were to fall, then I would have to sell at that lower price, right? So that would be price exposure, open to the marketplace. The other piece would be to look at is like, well, depending on how exposed I am, if I did sell as these prices go down, how much would that eat into my current profitability? Because one thing that we could look at it, if you had positive net income, positive profits at the end of the year, if the price drop was small enough, you might not have anything happen to your retained earnings, right? But if it was big enough and we had to actually see a decrease in our retained earnings, that's how you would handle the loss. So you move from being profitable into a net income loss situation, which would then have to be financed through your retained earnings as the cooperative.
And after the break, we'll get into the mechanics of what you've done and what you've discovered here. But as we talk about fertilizer as one of the functions of a cooperative here, this will differ in its orientation to what we think about in terms of, say, grains as inventories go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're correct, Eric. There are some important distinguishing differences between fertilizer markets and as we identify prices versus commodities such as corn or wheat and how we identify those commodities in price discovery.
And we want that to be kept well in mind as we discuss this further with Brian after we return from the break. Brian Briggeman is with us. He is the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University. And what we're talking about is a new analysis that he's been involved with, looking at farmer cooperatives and the likely impact of astronomically high fertilizer prices on those cooperatives moving forward into this next growing season. We'll be back with Brian shortly on This Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today returns now. We're in the midst of a conversation with the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University, Brian Briggeman. And again, what Brian and his associate have been doing of late is looking at fertilizer prices that be as high as they are and the potential ensuing impact on our farmer cooperatives as they serve as outlets for sales of those products to you producers. And Brian, how did you go about this?
So the model is fairly straightforward, and it follows a lot of the lessons that we learned through the 2007-2008 fertilizer price run-up and collapse. With looking at how exposed are you, again, to fertilizer price fluctuations, because that matters. If we had sold every single fertilizer contract or every single ton of fertilizer we bring in, then we go and buy it, well, we wouldn't have any price exposure. Well, that's not how agriculture works. We need to make sure that we have inventory on hand. So co-ops try to do the best that they can to try and align that sale and purchase together, the best that they can. But they're going to be open to some price fluctuations, certain amounts. But the other piece that we wanted to look at is like, okay, let's assume prices go down. And based off of how open you are to those price decreases, how much will that fertilizer write-down, assuming you sell it at that lower price, how will that eat into your existing profits? If you go to zero profits, then that would be it. But we're more interested in the more extreme cases where profits are not enough. You actually have to turn to your balance sheet and use some equity or retained earnings in order to finance that write-down. So we just varied price exposure, and then we varied the price decrease to see what would happen to retained earnings. How far down could it go?
Well, how do you break down that price exposure then?
Yeah, so what we did in the paper, and there's multiple ways you could do it, we just kept it fairly straightforward. Looked at a 25% price exposure, 50% price exposure, 75% price exposure. So the higher you're exposed, the more sensitive you are to price decreases in fertilizer. So 75% would be the most extreme case we looked at.
That would be where you've sold 25% of your inventory.
Correct.
So
Correct.
It's out of the worry
Right.
of having any price risk there. And then that write-down element, how do you gauge that in all of this too?
It's just looking at the inventory value and then decreasing it by that price amount. So just looking at that percentage drop that would occur in that inventory value and then say, do you have enough profits to absorb that? And if you don't, then that's when you have to turn to your balance sheet and use the equity to pay that off.
Those are the parameters of this stress test, as you put it. And,
Yep.
And then you actually applied that test to cooperatives and various sizes in terms of volumes of sales. What did you find out? Who's at risk and how much?
Yeah, so I think probably the big take-home message, co-ops, the majority of co-ops are well-financed, profitable, and have strong balance sheets. So this is, I would say, if we were to see prices fall, we're not going to see a rash of farmer cooperatives go bankrupt. That's not going to happen because especially looking at the financial strength that's out there. You know, co-ops, I'm in and out of boardrooms all the time, and this is something those board members talk a lot about. They have a fiduciary responsibility to those farmers that own this cooperative, and what that means, they have to put the interest of the membership at large to say, how do we make sure we're making decisions that this co-op is going to be here generations down the road, right? So we have to be very financially mindful. We have to make sure we have enough ability to absorb the unforeseen, right? Those black swan type events. So when we looked at the data and we first ran the stress tests, that's one thing that came out. So we're not talking that it's a widespread event, right? Yeah. The majority are well capitalized. But we did want to look at and say, well, are there some that might be more exposed that we need to be mindful of and thinking about? And
you did find those.
Yeah, we did. So one thing we did was we said, well, those that are predominantly grain cooperatives are likely not going to have that much fertilizer inventory, so we're going to set them aside. So those that have over, the majority of their sales come from grain, we're going to move them off to the side. We wanted to look at those that have a majority from supply, right? So they would be more exposed to fertilizer movements because that's where their business, operations focus on. So we want to look at those that are predominantly supply co-ops, and then to say those who are mixed, that have an even amount of supply and grain. Who are those and then where they're at. And then also to consider scale. The size of the cooperative might have an impact because we saw that back in 2007 and 2008. So we, again, went with the small, medium, and large, where small was less than $50 million in sales. Mid-size or medium is between 50 and 150 million sales, and then large is above 150 million.
So looking at those scales, as you just described them, one would intuitively assume that the smaller and the medium size might be more vulnerable than the larger cooperatives?
Yeah, those are the ones that were more exposed, which was, again, something that we saw back in 2007, 2008. But in particular, diving a little bit more, considering the focus of the co-op and where they primarily generate their sales, when we look at the small co-ops, those are predominantly supply. Mm-hmm. Those that are largely supply and are smaller, they tend to be more exposed in our stress test. So again, that means you're more open to market price movements, and then that big decrease in prices could have a big impact. And again, I must emphasize it's a could. We're playing scenarios here. Yeah. On the medium size, it tend to be those that are more mixed, that have a mix between grain and fertilizer would have that big decrease. And I probably know the next question you're going to ask is like, why? And I'm here to tell you, well, I'm just looking at financial statement data. There's maybe some reasons as to why that happens or why they're positioned. From the small on the supply, it's likely a scale issue in terms of just looking at the size of the cooperative, be able to absorb the loss. And the mix, it could be, who knows in terms of like where that's happening. But at least from the data that it came out, that's what we're seeing.
And then your larger cooperatives seem to be largely held harmless here, potentially so.
Potentially, unless, of course, they are very exposed to market movements. Right. And because we didn't run it all the way to 100%, that would be not a very good strategy, right, to be that open to market movements. But certainly could experience those decreases the more exposed you are to the market.
Then as you work with cooperatives routinely, what's the recommendation here as far as the best tactic to mitigate this risk for the cooperatives in general out there?
Well, speaking just with a real broad brush and a very high level, is you have to manage that fertilizer inventory very efficiently. Right. You need to be active with it. You need to understand what's going on. What are the market forces that are impacting it and are moving it? I've spoken to a number of cooperatives across the U.S. as well as here in Kansas, and there's a great deal of time, energy, and effort wanting to understand what's moving these markets, what's going on, when's the right time to be buying and selling. So speaking broadly, that's top of mind for many farmer cooperatives.
One thing that seems to make sense, though, Brian, is the cooperatives that can keep that inventory on hand at as minimum as possible and still keep a business flow going are in the best stead here.
Right. I mean, that's actually, when you think about it in a perfect, ideal textbook world, you wouldn't buy or have any inventory on hand until you sell it, right? So
hand to mouth.
Yeah, hand to mouth or just in time, inventory management. But that's not reality, right? That's, the extreme case. There's always going to be some of that inventory that's going to be purchasing. But I think some of the lessons learned, looking at, understanding how quickly you turn over that inventory. What is going on with planting expectations within your local area? If we're seeing a big shift to, say, soybeans that doesn't necessarily use as much fertilizer as, say, corn, well, that has implications, right? So we need to understand how quickly do we turn that fertilizer inventory over. But also, too, it's about that margin, right? To ensure that we know what those margins are in that fertilizer, because that ultimately goes into our profits. And then also trying to not be as open in the market as you can be. That's another really important piece of trying to align that buy-sell as closely as you can is another strategy that many farmer co-ops use to hopefully their benefit.
Well, this is an interesting and contemporary analysis of the fertilizer price situation as it might influence our farmer cooperatives in Kansas and therefore the farmer patrons that do business with those cooperatives. There's a paper on this very work, and it is available on the agmanager.info website.
Yes.
If you'd like to have a look at that.
That's correct, Eric. You can find it on agmanager.info. You can also find it on the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center's website, which is accc.ksu.edu.
We appreciate you going over this with us. As always, thanks. We'll talk again soon, Brian.
Thanks, Eric.
He's the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at Kansas State University. That's Brian Briggeman. Agriculture Today returns shortly on the K-State Radio Network. We are back now on this Agriculture Today, and for our weekly horticulture segment, something that could not be more timely. For virtually any homeowner out there with landscape plant material, you probably ought to take a second look now at the moisture status of that material. We'll talk here about winter watering of landscapes with Ward Upham, horticulturist, K-State Research and Extension. This is accented even more, Ward, by the fact that we are extraordinarily dry around Kansas, even more so than usual for the wintertime.
Yes, it is. And what makes it even worse is that we've been warm. And so that means we're losing moisture. And so we need to be concerned about certain trees and shrubs.
And the guidelines there, fairly standard as far as what those require, at least on a periodic basis, right?
That's right. As far as depth of watering, what we want to do is get that probably about 12 inches deep for our trees and shrubs. Even with mature trees, you're going to hit 80% of the roots if you get down to 12 inches. What you use is something like rebar, a wooden dowel, long tang screwdriver, even an electric fence post turned upside down. You can push it through moist soil. It's going to stop when it hits dry soil. And so that's an easy way to tell how deep you've actually watered.
Different trees have different demands to an extent, though, don't they?
Oh, yes, they certainly do, especially those that were transplanted last year. They don't have much of a root system yet, and so we need to really be careful with those. Even those transplanted within the last 2 to 3 years are going to need some special care. And then evergreens, because they're losing water through the winter, much more than deciduous trees are. Deciduous trees do lose water, but not near as much as what an evergreen would.
How to administer those waterings, though, and it's beyond just dragging a hose out there and turning it loose. You want this to happen gradually, do you not?
That's right, because it's easy to put on so much water so quickly it just runs off. So you need to have a method by which you can apply a little bit of water over a longer period of time. So if you have a recently transplanted tree, all you need to use is a 5-gallon bucket. Drill a hole in the side, 1/8 inch, near the bottom. That's going to let that water dribble out slowly. So you put that next to where that ball was, and then fill it up from another bucket and let it dribble out. Move the bucket to the other side of the tree, fill it up again, and let it dribble out. That'll give you 10 gallons of water. That should be enough for a recently transplanted tree or shrub. Now, those that are transplanted in the last 2 or 3 years are going to have more of a root system. What we normally use for them is a soaker hose, those black soaker hoses, and just circle the tree several times and then turn on the water just enough so that it will soak in. If you turn on too high, you'll probably get some runoff. And again, you're going to check how deep that goes with whatever tool you wish to use in order to check that.
Now, how critical is watering for those more mature trees? Yes, they need attention. But then again, they have been around the block a time or two. So are they more forgiving as far as watering?
They certainly are. You know, they're more mature. They're well established. If at all you're concerned, though, it'd be a good idea, especially if they're evergreen. If they're evergreen, you probably should water. If they're not, if you're at all concerned, go ahead and water them. And so what you want to do in that case is, again, use your soaker hose, but you're going to use a Y adapter on your garden hose so you can hook up both the beginning and the end of that hose to equalize pressure. Those soaker hoses are notorious for putting out more water from certain parts of that hose than other parts. If you hook both the beginning and end to a Y adapter, it equalizes the pressure, and you're much more likely to get a good job of watering. The drip line of the tree is the outermost spread of the branches. You want to put that hose between that drip line and halfway to the drip line. And so if you're going to hook both ends to that Y adapter, you may have to kind of serpentine around there in order for it to turn out right. But if you do that, that's going to work. The other thing to keep in mind on that Y adapter, you really should have a couple of valves on there for each leg. Mm-hmm. The reason for that is if you don't, you'll probably put on too much water and you get runoff. That way you can adjust the flow so you get just enough that it soaks in.
Follow these guidelines on watering your landscape ornamentals as we trudge our way through this winter season. Good tips all. Ward, thank you.
You bet.
Horticulturist Ward Upham, K-State Research and Extension, along with us. Our time's away once again. We appreciate you tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.